Welcome to Piece Timepiece. Today we're talking about the Bulova Accutron Astronaut, the coolest American watch ever made. As Soviet missile technology developed in the 1950s, the CIA couldn't rely on altitude alone to keep their reconnaissance pilots safe. After Gary Powers' U-2 spy plane was shot down, the CIA needed something new. Soviet missile technology and an escalating Cold War demanded a reconnaissance aircraft that could fly faster and soar higher than anything ever made. Able to fly over Mach 3 and up to 90,000 feet, the Lockheed A12 represented a staggering leap in aeronautics. The A12 was the first aircraft to incorporate stealth technology, and it was the first aircraft to be made of titanium. Keep in mind, late 50s, practically speaking, titanium didn't exist, and neither did computers, meaning that somehow this aircraft was designed with a slide rule and a pencil. Speaking of titanium, it was made entirely of the stuff, which it needed to be. At speeds above Mach 3, the A12 would reach external temperatures of over 800 degrees. It used a fuel engineered specifically for the A12 that had an important secondary function. The fuel also worked as a heat sink, helping to dissipate some of the heat generated from flying at supersonic speeds. As fuel burned off, its ability to dissipate heat was greatly reduced, and by the end of missions, in-cockpit temperatures could reach upwards of 150 degrees. Extreme altitude required pilots to wear pressure suits. Watches would be worn on the exterior of those suits in order to be read during flight, exposing them to pressure variance and intense heat. Harsh cockpit conditions would wreak havoc on mechanical watches, many of which were unable to maintain accurate timekeeping under such stress. Enter the Accutron Astronaut. Accutron's groundbreaking 214 tuning fork movement offered superior inertial properties and offered far superior accuracy through a range of temperature and pressure conditions. For the CIA, it was an easy choice. Pilots of the A12 would be issued Accutron astronauts. Now, 90,000 feet is high, but it's not space yet. And Mach 3 is fast, but we can do better. From the late 50s throughout the 1960s, North American aviation pioneered the X-15, a hypersonic, rocket-powered experimental research aircraft. The X-15 could fly to an altitude of 350,000 feet and is still the fastest manned, powered aircraft ever flown. Its record-setting top speed of Mach 6.72 set in 1967 remains unchallenged to this day. Its extreme altitude would qualify many of its test pilots for Air Force astronaut wings. The X-15 and the Accutron astronaut would fly to the edge of space and beyond, exceeding the Kármán line into outer space on 2 flights. Its data contributed to Apollo materials, structure, and thermal protection against aerodynamic heating at hypersonic speeds. Its mission-proven track record with the A12 made it an easy choice for the Air Force. Pilots of the X-15 would be issued Accutron astronauts. Speaking of X-15 pilots, recognize that guy wearing his? Just Neil Armstrong. Before we wrap up this intro, I want to note something for my viewers who weren't alive back then. Like myself, that when understanding the importance of these two aircraft, the X-15 represented something far greater to the collective American psyche. The A-12 was a technological masterpiece, but it was classified until 1982 and nobody knew about it. The X-15, on the other hand, was very much on public display. It was a symbol of American aeronautic accomplishment. The X-15 was unadulterated bedroom poster material, and it inspired a generation of Americans to go on and do great things. The X-15 looks cutting edge now. Imagine what it would have looked like in 1959 when this Edsel was new. Now, let's get to the Accutron. Quite simply, Bulova Accutron dominated timekeeping in the 1960s. Accutron was a breakthrough both in watchmaking and electronics, being the first to use a transistor, and it was a staple during the golden age of American space exploration. The Accutron astronaut you see here on the wrist of Gordo Cooper prior to Faith 7 was the first American watch in space in 1963. Accutron was on every manned spacecraft of the Gemini and Apollo programs of the 1960s. That's Gus Grissom wearing his prior to Gemini 5. It was on the ground at mission control. It was in lunar modules. One Accutron was even left on the moon as part of data transmitting instrumentation. Accutron was used in Cold War satellites. It was the first railroad-approved wristwatch, and it was the official gift of the State Department to foreign dignitaries under LBJ. Hell, for decades, Bulova's chairman was 5-star World War II General of the Army Omar Bradley. If you're an American watch collector, you owe it to yourself to check out an Accutron. And of all the Accutron models, I think the Astronaut is the best. This particular version is from 1968, and despite some of the borderline nationalistic grandstanding you just heard, what I have here is a rarer Swiss-made variant of the Astronaut. Other than country of origin, the American and Swiss varieties have two main differences. The American has a stainless steel bezel and printed indices, while the Swiss has a Bakelite bezel and applied indices. This is supposed to have a Bakelite bezel, but it's a 50-year-old watch. Bakelite is a brittle material. Things happen. Anyways, American looks on this one, Swiss brain. Let's look at some dimensions. And reintroducing what has been called the most precise instrument ever made, by me in my other video. The combination of this being a Swiss-made caliper and the endorsement of not one, but two old-school German woodworking equipment technicians leads me to believe that it is impossible for any human to create a more precise object. Could a machine, you ask? Maybe one day. Let's take a look. The watch is just shy of 38 millimeters wide. Very wearable in today's day and age. One of the most wearable sizes of any Accutron from that era. We've got a thickness of about 12.5 and a lug-to-lug measurement of around 38.5 millimeters. And kind of an Accutron thing, a lug width of 17.5 millimeters. Now let's flip this over and work the other side. So we have is a pilot's GMT watch, white on black on stainless tool watch. I mean, that's what it's about. We have the tuning fork Bulova logo at 12 o'clock. Very appropriate for this watch. Minute track around the outside, simple layout, but highly legible. You can see long, rectangular index-style hands and a wire-thin seconds hand that sweeps smoother than anything you can buy today. Finally, we have a Swan neck GMT arrow hand, curved just enough to glide over those applied indices. The loom is non-existent after 50 years. There are a couple small holes in the loom. I'm not sure if you can see that. Kind of a byproduct of 50 years exposure to radioactivity. Kind of the downside of vintage loom, but par for the course. The crystal is plastic and the bezel is stainless steel. We've got a bidirectional 24-hour GMT bezel. It doesn't click, but it does incorporate a nice feature to maintain its position. Under the bezel is a washer spring, keeping a bit of tension on the bezel. If I try to move it as is, it's not gonna budge, but if I push it down, it is able to rotate very easily. No problem moving it back and forth, but if I don't apply any pressure down, it's not going anywhere. So what I read is that back in the day, basically what you do, you drive over to get your Bulova, they'd sell you the watch and they'd include whatever strap you wanted. This is a Beads of Rice Jubilee strap that didn't come standard. I'm more than happy with this option, but I think the two bracelets that came standard were the Chrysler Coffin bracelet and a JB Champion bullet bracelet. So as with many Accutron clasps, this is how you adjust the bracelet, sort of like micro adjust type, but it's just really not even micro adjust, just flat out adjustment. It's how you size the bracelet. It works okay. Now, water resistance. This is a vintage watch, so both of these have pretty much the same. You may have noticed there is no crown on this watch, and that's for good reason. There is actually a crown, but it's just not in the traditional location. It's on the case back. You can see right here. Bulova really wanted to hammer home the idea that these watches were so accurate, there was no need to set them. Out of the factory, they were guaranteed to plus or minus 2 seconds per day, but since setting this to atomic time more than a month ago, it's now about 20 seconds fast, give or take half a second per day. Remarkable after 50 years, especially when you know what's going on inside the movement. To build the first electric watch that actually worked, Bulova had to pioneer an entirely new category of movement from the ground up. The tuning fork movement. Bulova called it the 214, a movement that was quite frankly epic. Instead of a spring-powered balance wheel beating 6 to 10 times a second, Accutron links a battery-powered oscillating tuning fork to an index wheel that advances 360 times a second. To this day, the Accutron index wheel remains a remarkable accomplishment of manufacturing, as each microscopic wheel contains 320 teeth, each only 10 microns deep. Long story short, the 360 Hz operating frequency translates to superb accuracy and the smoothest sweep money can buy. I'm a huge fan of spring drive, but spring drive ain't got nothing on Accutron. Fight me! To note, the GMT hand can't be set independent from the main hour hand, so to account for time zone changes, you'd have to rotate the bezel. If I wanted to read GMT time from the Eastern Standard Time Zone, I'd rotate the bezel 5 hours counterclockwise. Check it out. Like that. Don't think that because this is an electronic watch that it's cold and soulless. Quite the opposite. A byproduct of this movement is a faint humming sound. The oscillating frequency creates a warm, fairly high-pitched, resonating buzz. You can't hear it when it's on the wrist, you can't hear it when it's 5 inches away from your ear, but if you place the watch directly on your ear, you can hear the faint hum of a hard-working movement faithfully buzzing away after 50 years. It's like having a pet bumblebee. What could possibly be better than that? Battery life is around a year and a half, but a little bit more on that later. And then price-wise. So I got a great deal on this. It always bothered me when people on YouTube say they got a great deal on a watch, but then they don't say what that price was. I always said if I start my own channel, I'm never going to do that. But I just can't say it. I know it would kill some Accutron collectors out there to hear what I paid for it, so I won't say I got it with the box in great working condition for $500. I'd say that's probably low end of what you can expect to pay for a working watch in good condition. On the high end, you're looking at over $1,000 for a great example. That's a chunk of change, but when you think about the world of vintage GMT watches with spectacular heritage, you're often talking about many thousands of dollars. From that perspective, I think this watch represents some relative value. It's not all roses, though. The big downside about Accutron is its age. They haven't made these movements in decades, and after 50 plus years of running, they're starting to break down. Original replacement parts are still abundant, and they'll eventually run out, but I guess you could say that about any vintage watch. Having said that, as long as there's a collector's market, I have no doubt parts will be made to suit that market. As long as people have these watches, and they made millions of Accutrons, I'm sure someone out there is willing to make a few bucks and turn out some small batch parts. I hope. You also have the fact that the original 1.35 volt mercury batteries aren't made anymore. In fact, no type of 1.35 volt battery is made. You can solder in a resistor to modify your movement to accept a 1.55 volt modern battery, or hope your movement in your Accutron is one of the good ones like mine that can run accurately on a higher voltage. Mine is still accurate, but it's really not ideal to tax an already vintage movement with too much voltage. Finally, you can buy adapters that will fit with a 1.55 volt battery and reduce the output to 1.35 volt. That would be my recommendation, and it's going to be what I do when I change the battery. I'll put a link in the description to where you can still find those batteries. No affiliation, FYI. And then lastly, skilled Accutron specialists are becoming rarer and rarer. There's always going to be schmoes that are willing to ruin your watch while poking around the inside, but the people who really know what they're doing are retiring. Look, GMT pilots watches will never not be cool. Same thing with monochromatic stainless steel tool watches. Add the history and you've got an absolute icon of horology that's way under the radar. So that's going to do it for today. If you're still watching this, hit subscribe already. If you haven't seen my video on the other Bulova space watch, the Moon Watch, check that out. It's good. Link in description. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.